And this is primarily seen in colonization. And here's where I am going to show my nerdiness and show off exactly how much of an education geek that I am. This is my background and this is my area of expertise when it comes to education, is colonial mindsets, colonial systems. And what you need to remember when it comes to colonization is that it was important for colonizers, people who came to countries, to differentiate themselves from the people they were colonizing. They needed to find some way to make themselves important, to make themselves powerful. If you remember your history, you might well remember that Francisco Pizarro and the Spanish conquistadors came to Mexico and were seen and revered highly because of the metal armor that they had. They were seen to be gods because that had been foretold in local religions. But the difference was Pizarro and Cortez, were able to hold on to that power, were able to enhance that power by showing other ways in which they were different, by showcasing science, by showcasing other talents and other skills that they had. And one of the primary ways that this was done was by showing off a difference in terms of the education. You are able to start defining civilization, what a civilized group is, through knowledge that you claim is important. If you come in and are presenting yourselves as more powerful, you claim that you are civilized because you have the knowledge. And this is a fascinating method of maintaining power and maintaining authority because it works in two ways. On the one hand, it works to take the colonized people and force them into a position of subservience or a desire to raise themselves up to the standard of the colonizer. On the other hand, if it goes back to the colonizing country, you're able to assert your dominance and encourage other peoples to feel that it's important that you go and save these poor, different people by giving them the knowledge that you have. I'll give you a great example. My background is primarily in British colonization, British colonial education. One of the classic texts that exists involves British colonizers, a collection of government officials and missionaries, writing back about the terrible situation they found in sub-Saharan Africa when they talk about, and the people do not know how to read great literature, the people do not know how to write at all. This horrible situation must be prevented, must be solved, and we are in a position to bring our knowledge and our skills to them. A flood of more colonizers came to sub-Saharan Africa at the commands and at the requests and the pleas of the initial colonizers. And they came down to spread a certain kind of education. Literary education, literacy-based education. Now, the problem with this is that it fundamentally misunderstands the previous form of education. Remember I mentioned before that discussion, absorption, being absorbed in a set of ideas through communication, conversation, and sharing of ideas was, for a long time, a powerful way to communicate, a powerful way to learn. But when the West, particularly Western Europe, adopted more literacy-based education, they moved away from that and assumed that everyone else should do the same thing. Assumed that just because they now could use written works, the old methods of discussion and absorption in a topic were no longer valuable. Studies have suggested that in the colonial age, there were people who had dealt with as many philosophical, as many complex and serious thoughts as anyone in a literacy-based education model had before. The absorption model still worked. People were still learning history, we're still learning poetry, we're still learning broad philosophical ideas and dangerous concepts through absorption and discussion. But when colonizers arrived, they changed what the definition of civilization and what the definition of knowledge was to be a more literacy-based area. Literacy became the way to differentiate between those who were empowered and those who were not. It's the same as it was before, only now the power gap is based in large part on race. Not just on socioeconomic status, not just on individual status, but on race. Those of darker skin colors who were in the colonized countries were seen as without knowledge because their education system was still largely based in apprenticeship and absorption models. The white colonizers who were coming in from Europe and other places, Europe, who were basing their ideas on a literacy-based model. Literacy had become powerful enough for them, and they believed that that was the only method suddenly to encourage further understanding. Now, it's worth remembering, as we transfer here over from broad colonization around the world to just American literature, and specifically African American literature, that the United States was a colonial outpost of the British Empire. For several hundreds of years, we were a colonial outpost. And it's worth thinking about how exactly education worked within the colonial U.S. Now, on the left, you see a picture of a hall on Princeton College, and it's worth noting that Princeton follows that same literary model, the same literacy-based model that was empowered and seen as valuable in Europe. It hosts a number of our founding fathers. We have a founding father who attended what has become Columbia College. James Madison attended what is pictured here as becoming Princeton College, Princeton University. The powerful people, the sons of noblemen from England, the sons of the rich within the United States, become empowered by continuing the literacy education model. And those men go on to become the founding fathers. It's worth noting women also were not given this as an option, just the men. Now laborers, including, it should be noted, women and people who became part of the domestic center, were still taught in the same labor model, the same apprenticeship model that we've talked about before. You have a master, they show you how something is done, you repeat the skill over and over and over again. The middle class in colonial US really followed most closely along the apprenticeship model. The powered were a very small subset within the colonial setting. The laborers, the middle class, went through the apprenticeship model. And what ends up happening is that the disenfranchised, primarily the slaves, and to some extent some women, were given a disenfranchised model, a change in the absorption model. Rather than, as colonial teachers did, try to get some colonial subjects to read and to become members of the ruling class, within the United States, the disenfranchised or African American groups there were removed from any sense of education. Rather than teaching them how to read and write, rather than giving them the strengths and skills that would eventually make them empowered individuals, rather than teaching them a trade to make them part of the labor middle class individuals, they kept them disenfranchised by refusing to engage them in discussion. It's an absorption model wherein the thought is that you will just absorb what is said to you rather than engage with it. Slaves weren't encouraged to question or demand any answers for what their situation was. They were simply told what it was. One of the great examples of this is the Bible, and you'll read this in Frederick Douglass's writing, how the Bible was presented to slaves during Sunday schools, fundamentally, wherein certain passages were read about being subject to a master, knowing one's role, knowing one's place, and accepting that what you have and what you're given is what you deserve. And you need to be kind and to be courteous to your master, for he is fundamentally your God. There's no room for discussion. There's no room for true communication, but there is room for absorption still. Hear the words that are said and believe them. Just believe them. Without the power to read and write, they won't ever become empowered. They might have some apprenticeship education, learning how to work in the fields, but that's all working to the masters and the slave owners. The only other form of education, the most common form of education, was the disenfranchised absorption model.